Schultz laughed, it wasn't loud. It was sharp, controlled. The kind of laugh meant to remind a man exactly where he stood. He did it standing in the back room of a Harlem nightclub, cigar smoke curling around his fedora, eyes fixed on the tall black man who hadn't flinched once since walking in. Dutch Schultz, the most feared bootlegger north of Midtown, had come personally. That alone was supposed to mean something. But the man across from him didn't move, didn't bow, didn't smile. Bumpy Johnson stood still, hands clasped behind his back, face unreadable. The room was packed with Schultz's men, Jewish and Italian gunmen lining the walls, coats heavy with hidden steel. Harlem's air felt tighter for it. Schultz finally spoke. "You run a nice little corner up here," he said calmly. "But let's not get confused. This is my city." The words hung there, heavy. This was how Dutch Schultz operated. He underestimated first. He disrespected first. He made men shrink with implication alone. Bumpy Johnson didn't respond right away. He looked past Schultz instead. At the men with guns, at the walls that had heard threats before, at the neighborhood that had bled quietly for decades. Then he stepped forward. Just one step, and the entire room went silent. What happened next would not end in that room. It would echo through Harlem, through the mafia's power structure, and through Dutch Schultz's fate itself. Because this wasn't just a meeting. This was a mistake. And Dutch Schultz had just made it. Years before that night, before Harlem learned to say his name in a whisper and a warning, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived from South Carolina with a temper sharpened by injustice and a mind built for strategy. They would later call him Bumpy, a childhood nickname earned from the hard knot on the back of his head. But Harlem would come to know him by something else entirely: presence. The Harlem of the early 1930s was alive and wounded at the same time. Jazz spilled out of basements. Numbers runners whispered on street corners. Churches fought to keep souls while bootleggers fought for territory. White mobsters controlled the money. Black neighborhoods absorbed the consequences. And Harlem remembered everything. Bumpy Johnson learned quickly that respect wasn't requested. It was enforced. He watched men get humiliated by police who called them boy and walked away smiling. He saw white racketeers extract profits while leaving bodies behind. Harlem had power, but it didn't control its destiny. That bothered Bumpy more than anything. He read philosophy. He quoted Shakespeare. He walked the streets dressed sharp, speaking soft, listening hard. And when he acted, it was precise, calculated, never reckless. Harlem noticed. By the time Dutch Schultz's name started circulating uptown, Bumpy Johnson already controlled numbers operations, street crews, and, most importantly, loyalty. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a problem solver. When disputes broke out between hustlers, Bumpy settled them. When police pressure mounted, Bumpy adapted. When Harlem needed protection, Bumpy provided it, quietly. Dutch Schultz didn't see that. Schultz saw Harlem as territory, numbers, money, a market ripe for intimidation. He was a Bronx-born bootleg king with a reputation for brutality that bordered on madness. He tortured men personally. He smiled while doing it. And he believed fear was more powerful than respect. So when his lieutenants warned him about Bumpy Johnson, Schultz dismissed it. "A colored numbers runner?" he scoffed. "I'll own him by Tuesday." That arrogance would cost him dearly. Schultz pushed into Harlem aggressively. His collectors demanded higher cuts. His men beat runners in the street. They sent messages the way they always did, fast and violent. Harlem simmered. Bumpy didn't react immediately. That was his first lesson to Schultz. Silence could be louder than gunfire. Instead, Bumpy watched. He mapped patterns. He learned which cops Schultz paid off, which politicians looked the other way, which businessmen whispered Schultz's name with fear. Bumpy understood something Schultz never did. Harlem wasn't just streets. It was people, and people remembered who stood up for them. When Schultz finally demanded a meeting, it wasn't a negotiation. It was a summons. That back room, that laughter, that assumption of dominance. Schultz believed he was about to collect Harlem like overdue rent. But Bumpy Johnson had already decided something long before he stepped into that room. He wasn't going to fight Dutch Schultz like a street thug. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to posture. He was going to let Schultz underestimate him. Because when a man shows you how little he thinks of you, he also shows you exactly where to strike. As Schultz's smile faded and Bumpy took that single step forward, every man in the room felt it. The shift. The air changed. The power dynamic cracked just slightly. Dutch Schultz didn't recognize the warning. History would. The confrontation had begun. Dutch Schultz had built his reputation on one simple belief. Intimidation solved everything. If fear didn't work, pain would. And if pain failed, death always finished the job. That formula had made him rich, untouchable, and dangerously confident. So when Bumpy Johnson took that step forward and didn't lower his eyes, Schultz felt something unfamiliar tug at his nerves. Not fear, annoyance, the kind that came when a man refused to understand his place. "You hear me, Johnson?" Schultz said, voice smooth but edged with warning. "I'm offering you a chance to stay alive and profitable. Harlem answers to me now." Bumpy finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Harlem doesn't answer to outsiders," he said evenly, not without consequences. A few of Schultz's men shifted their weight. That wasn't supposed to happen. Conversations like this usually ended with nods, handshakes, and future obedience. Schultz smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Consequences," he repeated. "You threatening me, boy?" The word landed hard, deliberate, calculated. Schultz used it the same way he used a knife. Slow, humiliating, meant to cut dignity first. Bumpy didn't react the way Schultz expected. No anger, no flash. He simply tilted his head, studying Schultz like a chessboard. "No," Bumpy said. "I'm explaining something you don't understand yet." That was when Schultz stood up. Chairs scraped the floor. Hands moved closer to coats. Power demanded a physical response. "You don't explain anything to me," Schultz snapped. "You work for me, or you disappear." Bumpy leaned in just enough for Schultz to hear him clearly. "You disappear in Harlem," Bumpy said calmly. "Only if Harlem lets you." For a moment, Schultz considered killing him right there, ending the insult permanently, but something stayed his hand. Maybe it was the eyes watching him, not afraid, not pleading. Or maybe it was instinct. Predators sometimes sense when a hunt isn't as simple as it looks. Schultz broke the moment with a sharp laugh. "You got guts," he said. "I'll give you that. But guts don't stop bullets." "No," Bumpy replied, "but loyalty does." The meeting ended without bloodshed, which Schultz considered mercy. He left Harlem that night, convinced Bumpy Johnson would fold under pressure. He always did this next. Squeeze, isolate, humiliate. The pressure came fast. Schultz's men doubled their collections. They beat runners who refused. They shut down operations by force. One night, a trusted Harlem numbers man was found with broken fingers. A message signed in silence. Harlem waited for Bumpy to respond. He didn't. Days passed, then weeks. Schultz mistook the quiet for a surrender. His arrogance grew. He began telling associates that Harlem was already his, that Bumpy Johnson was smart enough to know when to kneel. What Schultz didn't see was the web tightening around him. Bumpy moved through Harlem like a shadow, talking to people Schultz never noticed. Store owners, church leaders, dock workers. He didn't promise revenge. He promised stability, protection, dignity. Then Bumpy did something Schultz never expected. He reached out to the Italians. Lucky Luciano's syndicate had its own issues with Schultz. The man was volatile, unpredictable, and too loud. He drew attention. He didn't respect structure. To men who preferred order and quiet profit, Schultz was a liability. Bumpy understood power differently than Schultz ever would. He knew alliances mattered more than brute force. He didn't posture. He positioned. In private rooms and whispered conversations, Bumpy framed Schultz not as an enemy, but as a problem that needed solving. A man whose recklessness endangered everyone's money. Harlem was just the flashpoint. Meanwhile, Schultz kept pushing. He ordered one of Bumpy's lieutenants dragged into the street and beaten in broad daylight. Blood stained the pavement. Harlem watched. The message was clear: submit or suffer. That was the moment Bumpy decided the lesson had to be taught publicly. He didn't strike back immediately. Instead, he allowed Schultz to feel comfortable, powerful. Schultz began spending more time downtown, celebrating early victory. His guard dropped just enough. Behind the scenes, Bumpy ensured something else. Harlem stood united. No one paid Schultz, not a dime. Numbers runners hid. Businesses closed early. Streets went quiet. Schultz was furious. He sent word demanding another meeting. This time, it wouldn't be polite. The location was different. Neutral ground. A hotel suite downtown. White walls, white men, white confidence. Schultz believed he controlled this environment completely. Bumpy arrived alone. No entourage, no visible weapon, just presence. Schultz leaned back in his chair when he saw him. "You had your chance," Schultz said coldly. "Now I'm done asking." Bumpy didn't sit. "So am I," he replied. Schultz stood abruptly, slamming his hand on the table. "You think your people matter to me," he shouted. "I'll burn Harlem to the ground if I have to." That was the mistake. Bumpy stepped closer, his voice low, carrying a weight Schultz couldn't dismiss. "You already lost," Bumpy said. "You just don't know it yet." Schultz laughed, but this time it was forced. "And how's that?" Bumpy met his eyes. "Because you came alone," he said. "And I didn't." Schultz looked around the room instinctively. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. Outside that door, decisions were already in motion. Alliances had shifted. Lines had been drawn. This wasn't just a turf war anymore. This was about to become a reckoning. Dutch Schultz didn't sleep that night. He left the hotel suite angry, pacing, replaying Bumpy Johnson's words over and over again. "You already lost." The sentence gnawed at him. Schultz had lived his entire criminal life believing one thing: dominance was immediate. You crushed resistance before it organized. And yet Harlem hadn't broken. Instead, it had gone quiet. too quiet. Schultz's collectors reported empty streets, closed doors, runners who vanished before pickup times. Businesses that once paid on schedule now claimed innocence or ignorance. Harlem had become a wall, unified, disciplined, defiant. That kind of coordination didn't happen by accident. Schultz suspected betrayal. He always did. He began lashing out at his own men, accusing them of weakness. One lieutenant was pistol-whipped for suggesting caution. Another was sent away entirely. Fear ruled Schultz's inner circle now, and fear made mistakes inevitable. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson moved with deliberate calm. He understood that confrontation didn't always mean gunfire. Sometimes it meant forcing a man to confront his own isolation. Bumpy had already secured something Schultz couldn't fight with bullets: legitimacy among the syndicate. Lucky Luciano and his associates didn't trust Schultz. They tolerated him. Big difference. And now, thanks to Schultz's recklessness in Harlem, tolerance was wearing thin. Bumpy never demanded action. He simply presented reality. Schultz brings heat, he told them, and heat burns money. That argument carried weight. The turning point came when Schultz made his boldest and final miscalculation. He ordered a hit, not on Bumpy directly, that would have sparked an uncontrollable war, but on one of Harlem's most respected numbers, bankers, a man protected quietly by Bumpy's network. The killing was brutal, public, meant to shatter morale. Instead, it sealed Schultz's fate. Harlem erupted, not in chaos, but in resolve. Streets filled with murmurs, churches whispered names. Even men who had once feared Schultz now spoke openly against him. The community didn't cry for vengeance. It demanded removal. Bumpy attended the victim's funeral in person. No speech, no threats, just presence. Harlem saw him there, standing tall, dignified, unafraid. That image traveled faster than any bullet ever could. Within days, the syndicate made its decision. Schultz was no longer an asset. He was a liability. And liabilities, in that world, were dealt with quietly. The night it happened, Schultz sat in a Newark restaurant, surrounded by familiar faces. Men he trusted. Men he believed feared him enough to stay loyal. He laughed, drank, boasted. Then the guns came out. By the time Schultz realized what was happening, it was already over. Multiple shots, no warning, no chance to bargain. The legend of Dutch Schultz ended in a pool of blood, betrayed by the very system he thought he controlled. News reached Harlem before dawn. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once when the message came. The reckoning was complete. Harlem belonged to Harlem again. In the days that followed, power dynamics shifted visibly. Italian syndicate representatives came uptown respectfully. Agreements were discussed, not demanded. Bumpy negotiated terms that protected Harlem's autonomy while maintaining profitable peace. No humiliation, no chest-thumping, just balance. Men who once looked past Bumpy now addressed him carefully. Police adjusted their posture. Numbers operations resumed. Orderly, protected, disciplined. Harlem breathed again. Bumpy had done what Schultz never could. He commanded respect without terror. And the lesson traveled far beyond New York. Underestimating Bumpy Johnson had cost Dutch Schultz everything. Not because Bumpy was more violent, but because he was more intelligent, more patient, and more rooted in his community. That difference mattered. Harlem never forgot it. The morning after Dutch Schultz was buried by his own excesses, Harlem woke up different. There were no parades, no headlines celebrating victory, just a quiet understanding that something heavy had been lifted. Men walked straighter. Store owners opened their doors without looking over their shoulders every few seconds. The streets felt owned again, not by fear, but by familiarity. Word traveled the way it always did in Harlem, mouth to mouth, block to block. Schultz is gone. Bumpy stood his ground, but the truth ran deeper than rumor. The Italians came uptown within the week, not with guns, with hats in their hands and proposals instead of threats. They met Bumpy Johnson on neutral ground, a private room above a restaurant, sunlight cutting through cigar smoke. This time, Bumpy sat at the head of the table. The men across from him understood something Dutch Schultz never had. Harlem wasn't conquered. It was negotiated with, and Bumpy Johnson was its voice. "There won't be collectors shaking down families," Bumpy said calmly. "No men dragged into alleys," he continued, "and no decisions made about Harlem without Harlem present." There was no argument. The syndicate nodded. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. Peace meant profit. Stability meant longevity. And Bumpy Johnson had proven he could deliver both without drawing unnecessary blood. That was justice, not loud, not cruel, but corrective. The police noticed too. Raids slowed, patrols changed their routes. Officers who once swaggered through Harlem with batons loose on their belts now kept things procedural. Respect didn't mean friendliness, but it meant restraint. Bumpy never claimed credit publicly. He didn't give interviews. He didn't posture. He allowed Harlem to speak for itself. People remembered who had stood between them and annihilation. Numbers runners resumed their work, not exploited, not abused. Disputes were handled internally, quietly. Bumpy enforced discipline with logic before violence, and violence only when logic failed. That restraint elevated him beyond a street boss. He became a stabilizing force, a necessary one. Even rivals acknowledged it. Men who once tested Harlem's boundaries reconsidered. They'd seen what happened to Schultz. Not because Bumpy pulled the trigger, but because he controlled the board. The most telling moment came weeks later when a younger hustler approached Bumpy on the street, anger in his eyes. "They disrespected us," the man said. "Why don't we take more now?" Bumpy studied him carefully before answering. "Because power taken without discipline collapses," he said, "and we're not here to collapse." That philosophy became law. Justice in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. You didn't destroy a man unless he made destruction unavoidable. Schultz had crossed that line himself. The community understood the difference. Church leaders stopped pretending crime didn't exist and started acknowledging order where chaos once ruled. Business owners invested again. Harlem's underworld, for the first time in years, operated with an internal code, one rooted in survival, not ego. Bumpy walked the streets openly. No convoy, no body armor, just confidence earned through consistency. That was the final insult to men like Dutch Schultz, a man who needed fear to feel powerful. Bumpy needed none of it. And that's what made him dangerous. Years passed, but the story never faded. In Harlem, time didn't erase moments like that. It sharpened them. Dutch Schultz became a cautionary name, spoken with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. Not because he died violently, many men did, but because he died wrong. He had misunderstood the ground beneath his feet. Bumpy Johnson, on the other hand, became something more than a gangster. He became a reference point. When disputes rose, people asked, what would Bumpy do? When outsiders tested boundaries, they were warned quietly. Harlem isn't what it used to be. The balance Bumpy created held, not perfectly. Nothing ever did, but long enough to matter, long enough to prove a point. He continued negotiating with the Italian syndicates as an equal, not a subordinate. They didn't always like him. They respected him. And in that world, respect lasted longer than fear. Bumpy's reputation traveled beyond New York. In Chicago, men spoke of Harlem as organized, disciplined. In the South, hustlers whispered his name as proof that a black man could stand against the most powerful criminal forces in America and win without surrendering his dignity. But Bumpy never framed it that way. He didn't call himself a symbol. He called himself responsible. He funded community efforts quietly, paid lawyers when kids got caught up in the system, ensured families weren't destroyed over minor infractions. These acts weren't charity. They were infrastructure. Power, in Bumpy's mind, meant obligation. The story of Dutch Schultz's underestimation became part of Harlem folklore. Old-timers told it on stoops, embellishing only slightly. They remembered the fear before, the calm after. They remembered how one man refused to bow. And they remembered the lesson. Intimidation fails when unity holds. Bumpy aged, but his posture never bent. Even as laws changed, even as federal pressure increased, the legend stayed intact. He had already proven his worth in the moment that mattered most. When Harlem's dignity was challenged by a man who believed dominance came with whiteness, money, and brutality alone. Dutch Schultz had believed violence made him untouchable. Bumpy proved strategy made you eternal. This wasn't just a story about Dutch Schultz losing a power struggle. It was about a man who walked into Harlem believing fear was enough and walked out of history as a warning. Dutch Schultz underestimated Bumpy Johnson because he misunderstood what real power looked like. He saw numbers, territory, profit. Bumpy saw people, memory, pride. And that difference decided everything. Bumpy Johnson didn't defeat Schultz with louder guns or crueler violence. He defeated him by refusing to be rushed, refusing to be humiliated, and refusing to let Harlem be treated like property. He let his enemy reveal his flaws. He let arrogance overreach. Then he allowed the system Schultz relied on to remove him. That's what made it legendary. Because the most dangerous response to disrespect isn't rage. It's discipline. The kind that waits. The kind that calculates. The kind that understands justice doesn't always arrive with applause, but it always leaves a mark. Harlem didn't just survive that moment, it claimed it. Bumpy Johnson's legacy wasn't built on intimidation. It was built on restraint, loyalty, and an unspoken promise to his community. No one will ever walk in here and treat us like we don't matter. And that's why this story still matters. Because sometimes the greatest stand isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and immovable. Sometimes it's a single step forward in a smoke-filled room. And the understanding that once respect is drawn, it will not be surrendered. This wasn't just about one man's pride. This was about a community's dignity. And history remembers the difference.